Good afternoon, everybody. This is Peter. This is our August 12th biweekly radio address. Hope everyone's doing well. I am going to go through a slew of questions, as I always do. Jacques and Roxanne will not be on this particular broadcast. They're on every other week. Well, every other 2 weeks, actually. Well, actually, every other 2-week broadcast, excuse me. I keep thinking I'm going to go and do this every week, but every time I try to set that up, my time gets so complex that it becomes so difficult. As you can imagine, with the new film coming along, it's been growing more and more difficult to keep this stuff going. But there are other radio shows that have been popping up out there, and I've been trying to find time to listen to those that are beginning to represent the movement, the Venus Project as well. And I definitely encourage you. I know chapters even have radio shows as well. And then Blog Talk Radio, it's amazing the technology we have today as far as communication. The era of media elitism is certainly over. Now it's just a massive cesspool, that's the wrong language. Now it's just a massive party of media. Anyone can make movies, anyone can make music, anyone can do anything with the advent of computer technology, and it's incredible, and it's good and bad too. You know, you have a lot of noise out there, but you also have a lot of signal coming through, and that's really important, things that never would have come through before, as the media has always historically been dominated. So, on that note, I have a audio-video page that has been added to the Movement site. Maybe you guys have noticed that. And it's going to be expanded greatly. It's in conjunction with our YouTube official channel, though it doesn't always have to associate with it. The TZM official channel, if you were to search that in YouTube, is now set up, and Brandon is working with that. You can email Brandon if you have something you would like to put on that channel, say something that you find that somebody else has posted. We want to try and get all of the best videos of the Venus Project and anything associated with the movement, even activist interests. For example, Zeitgeist Day from 2008, 2009. There are tons of clips of other countries that had Zeitgeist Day information, so we can make a category for that. Basically, try to get everything that's been loosely tossed up on YouTube or on Google Video or any media site for that matter. Get those videos downloaded and reposted on our official YouTube account, so there can be a nice archive of what's been happening. And for new members, they can go somewhere, and very often in this culture, people would rather watch videos than read anything. So that's going to be a very good thing. So that's been in development. So if you have something, please email Brandon through the Zeitgeist Movement official channel. You can search for it. Second announcement: the domains for the Zeitgeist Media Project and From Earth to Venus, those two team projects, essentially, that I denoted in the email that was sent out, if you received that, they have been reserved, and we're going to start setting those up soon. The Earth to Venus project is a very interesting one. We're going to use Google API programming for that, and I hope that works out. In other words, you can use layers on on Google Earth, and you can create layers for different attributes. So we'll begin, the first layer naturally would be an assessment of the Earth's resources. So we begin by adding a layer for all the energy resources, and then work from there. And we'll see what we can do with that. I'm going to be working with some people to help assess the programming on that. I think that's going to be a terrific project if it works out the way I hope it will. And it will be amazing after, say, 6 to 8 months if people are dedicated to do this, when somebody comes and says, wow, these people are redesigning the planet. And we're not redesigning it based on opinion. Everything will have a tangible orientation to resources, availability, and production methods based on region, and all the other tangibles that we continually talk about as far as arriving at the decisions that we do for society, as opposed to just flagrantly generating decisions through politics or whims, or essentially how the world is run today. So that's really exciting for me. The Zeitgeist Media Project, again, I've talked about this before, and I apologize for the delay in getting this up there, but it will be for anyone that works in media, music, art, video, obviously, graphic design, 3D, all of those attributes are very relevant. And it will be a network of people that want to work for, this isn't for generating profit. Everything will be posted on for free. The entire thing will be free, naturally. If someone had a larger order of production that they wanted to put together and they needed funding to do it, well, that's a different issue, and we can deal with that if it comes down to it. But the Zeitgeist Media Project will be simply a hub for people to work together to present new media about social change and the social therapy, which is the most important attribute of all of this. As I've stated repeatedly, usually in refutation of those that want to jump and build a commune or put all the technological aspects into operation immediately. The real issue is the social therapy, and that's really what we're about. We're about affecting a broad social change, and nothing's more powerful than art, as I think many of you know. People often ask me, what's the role of art in this system? It seems like everything's very scientific. Art is essentially creativity, and creativity is everything as far as creation. Art has a spectrum, of course. Art for the sake of art is on one side, and art for the sake of social meaning and affecting change is on the other side. It should be no wonder that some of the most amazing art has been that art which has been so relevant to society. For example, religion would not be what it is today if it wasn't for the amazing visual art and music that have been created that supported all of those religious ideals. Churches, you walk into these incredible cathedrals, it's an artistic aura. And that's really where the influence comes from. I hate to use the word manipulation, but that's basically what it is. There's a reason why I say John Lennon's Imagine is one of the most prolific, listened to, known songs on the face of the earth, because it has a social context. Art for the sake of art is unique in and of itself, but the original Zeitgeist production was an artistic production done in Lower Manhattan. It was just an artistic piece, never intended to be a movie. And it's interesting to relay that because people still don't understand that. In fact, I have some photographs of the original event. I should probably post those just for those that are curious. Art is extremely powerful. So the Zeitgeist Media Project is going to be about creating a social gesture and getting it out to the public in as many ways as possible. There's no monopoly here. I'm not, the Zeitgeist thing is a concept, and it's, while I'm working on the third film, I want everyone to, you don't even have to use the term Zeitgeist. Maybe in the Zeitgeist Media Project we'll have a logo that says that it's associated with the Zeitgeist Movement. That could be something to bring it together, but it's really just getting this way of looking at the world out there, this rational, scientific way of looking at the world, and there's a lot of artistic elements in rationality. It isn't just some cold science. It's all a matter of discovery, and that's really what creativity is. So that is that issue. Quick note, I want to throw this out there because I wasn't sure if people were aware of this, but the Venus Project is going to be heading to the UK, I believe in September, so you might want to look out for that. I'm still waiting on details from them about that. Unfortunately, I can't go. I was just there. It's unfortunate the timing, but I have to work on the new film, and I have a number of other obligations. But nevertheless, please look out for that, because that will be hopefully a big event. I think they're going to be going to a few locations in Europe, but don't quote me on that. We can wait to hear from them on that, but that's exciting. And generally speaking, that's about all I'm going to announce for right now. There are a lot of other things in the back burner, but I think some of them might be addressed in the questions, so I'm going to go ahead and shoot into those so we have time. Okay, question number 1. Peter, you have said that we are growing, but not quite fast enough. To you, how quickly do you expect this movement to be growing? Perhaps you could outline what the aims are for growth in your mind. Well, that's an ongoing relativity, so to speak. There's two paths I would think about. There's the raw numbers. I would love to have that news report go out about the Zeitgeist movement having 150 million members. That's just a general behind supportive number that people arbitrarily, regardless of where they are, regardless of the relationship to how many people are on the planet, would find impressive. And I think we'll eventually get there. The other side is the percentage of each country. That's another way to look at it. I would say 10 to 15% of each country initially would be extremely impressive. Obviously, that's very dramatic if you look at the quantitative numbers on that. But nevertheless, we need pockets everywhere, and I don't want to see some massive concentration in the West. I really hope that this can spread just about everywhere. So I'm not going to try and think about it that way. I am goal oriented, but we have to let this flow. Again, nothing like this has ever been done, so we can't get emotional about issues of wanting this and wanting more numbers and figuring out how to do it. We just have to be honest and move forward, and I think the numbers will fall in line as the economic collapse continues, as people grow to understand the direction that we talk about. Again, we're in our infancy, and I hope everyone really understands that. And suggestions to move faster are always good, but it really comes down, as I denoted before, to getting the information out there in creative ways. And eventually, in the transition, we'll begin a research city. But I'm not going to go into that right now. Number two, hi Peter, I have a relatively simple idea to spread awareness even faster. We need a symbol, something simple that would evoke curiosity, something that would we could put on our clothing, our cars, etc. What do you think? Well, I stay away from symbols in general. Symbols tend to lead to misinterpretations, and considering this weird small subsect of strange, usually religiously minded individuals who think that there's some kind of conspiracy behind the Venus Project, symbology tends to cloud things. I really don't care for symbols. Again, you're talking to someone that researched to an incredible length about symbology, and I've looked at all of the general research on the use of symbols and how they, from anything from Freemasonic symbols to all that crap that you hear about now. I've researched the work of Jordan Maxwell, which I appreciate, but symbols get blown out of proportion. Some even go so far to say symbols have some power, and if you're surrounded by symbols, I think David Icke likes to talk about stuff like that. You're surrounded by these symbols and they control you in some way. That's nonsense. Symbols are just images, and I think images are arbitrary ultimately. They have definition based on association. I like the globe that we have along with the simple name because it's simplistic, and no one can read into it, no one can project into it. I don't want any more symbol. I don't care for a symbol. I really don't think it's relevant. And I think the use of symbols is generally elitist. Like when you see someone wearing a symbol like a cross, I don't appreciate that. It's separatist. So granted, there's a paradox there. If you're going to talk about anything or represent anything, you might have a symbology or it's inherently symbolic because you're restricting some form of information in some realm. Nevertheless, I don't care for symbols. I think the globe is fine and it's universal enough to represent the movement. And it's very simplistic and it won't fall victim to a lot of the things that other symbols do. So I hope that's clear. I just don't see it as a big issue. Number three. Here, this one relates to the symbols as well, actually. What was your intention for using the eye as one of the main images in Zeitgeist? I only ask because I want to provide a straight answer for all the conspiracy nuts out there labeling it as evidence of the Illuminati. Yeah, well, unfortunately, the Illuminati doesn't have the trademark on the use of the human eyeball. So, why do I use the eye? The eye represents awareness and consciousness, just an age-old, again, symbol. It's an age-old reflection of our what we see around us in our minds, and that's basically it. What's the old adage? The eye is the window to the soul, and that's a common notion. The eye is a very powerful gesture. Just the very notion of the complexity of the eye, and what the eye represents, of course, what it sees, what's behind the eye, which projects what it wants to see. It has nothing to do with the Illuminati, so obviously it has nothing to do with the Illuminati. It certainly didn't get it from there. And, so if you were to deal with people, you just tell them the eye is even long before the Illuminati ever existed, the eye was always a symbol of awareness and consciousness, and that should shut them up. Number four, if you have connections with Hollywood, then why don't you send them the Venus Project's movie script? Isn't that the best way to introduce them to this type of society? From what I understand, the script isn't done. If the script was done and there was a package together, then I would most certainly do whatever I could. But as far as I know right now, the script isn't done. I know people here and there have been helping out, and there was some good progress that I had heard before. But until it's done, there's not too much I can do. There's only so much I can do in general. I'm trying to, of course, work on the new film, but I'm definitely encouraging them to get people behind the new script. I know in the past radio broadcast that Roxanne mentioned that if anyone wants to help out with the script and they have experience with script writing, because you can imagine how many people would just want to jump on board and just randomly start helping and writing things and how chaotic that might be. So professionalism in a certain sense of experience in formulating stories and narratives is relative to this, because I think what they're going for is a combination of something that's somewhat experimental, but also something that will fulfill the formula of most Hollywood films. So it's to use the tradition of the Hollywood structure, in other words, love stories, the general formatting, the general arcs that you always see in all these Hollywood films, to use those structures, but put in the Venus Project as the content. So, if you have experience doing that, then email Roxanne. I'm not sure what the status of the script is right now, but I know it's not finished. Number five, the movement seems to be active on the internet, but shouldn't we also be active in universities, colleges, Hollywood, and indie filmmakers? Absolutely. This is where, as far as colleges and universities, this is where the regional chapters and lecture teams will come in. I think, as I mentioned before, the lecture teams really will begin to pair with the regional chapters, especially, say, the state chapters in the United States. If we can get a small team of people, pockets, that can have the time to, say, on a weekend, go to a college in their area and set up a small lecture, that's a brilliant start, and I certainly encourage it. I'm working more with this. It's difficult because it's my hope, I guess in the back of my mind, I hope people will learn the information enough and can be trustworthy enough to represent this information in a way that is of high quality. But of course, I know that some might not fully understand it, and they might not be able to handle the Q&A, because as you might see, the Q&As can get very intense with people. And then, as far as I'm concerned, the Q&As are always more important than the presentation in a lot of ways, just because you get to target all of the attributes that all the nuances in people's minds that things haven't quite clicked. As I mentioned before, I get asked the same general questions a lot. They just come from different angles, and that's good. I mean, it takes a lot of time to do that, and every time I try to present a new presentation, I try to target more and more about specific issues, which is, for example, what I tried to do in the UK presentation, which, again, I apologize, is not up in high quality right now. There are a few people that are working on that, and there were some changes that was being made to one of the videos that was presented to me. But anyway, by all means, and indie filmmakers, yes, the Zeitgeist Media Project is there. Hollywood, obviously, we need to try and do something to get influence. So I hope that answers your question. It's tricky, and it's just a matter of people finding the initiative to do so. It doesn't cost a lot of money to set up a small lecture, to get a simple projector for, say, 100, 200 people. It just takes a little bit of courage to stand in front of everybody and do this, and that's really what it comes down to. But I'm going to be in contact with the lecture team soon. We readjusted the teams. I just want to get more material together in a package format, so the lecture team knows in a little more concise way what to do. In other words, I'm going to set up a package which talks about how to go about the entire process of setting up an event. And the package will include, of course, all existing media and things like that. But I'll talk about that more in the future. But please, if you have an accord to do so, get out there and do it. Number 6. Where do you see the direction of narrative fiction heading in the future? Although I agree that our language today does have many ambiguities, within the realm of fictional writing, this non-certainty can be exploited to creative effect. Would a more mathematically based language system remove this cognitive effect on the reader? Well, you're jumping into a realm that I think neither I, maybe even not even Jacques, quite know where that's going to go. I mean, language in the sense of scientific language does exist today in the form of mathematics. When someone communicates a mathematical problem, it's nearly universal. But there's always going to be interpretation when it comes to our general language. For example, in music can be transferred from one person to another very easily through dots on a page. That's almost entirely universal as far as I know today. However, the interpretation of that music can, of course, be very, very different. So there's always that ambiguity. I think the ambiguity will always exist on a certain level. Even in mathematics, there's some people that might question certain attributes that are relayed in a larger theoretical way. So, I don't know, narrative fiction, I mean, if you think about books like Finnegan's Wake, that's a bizarre, interesting treatise on how far you can go with making a text that is absolutely abstract. I think the book was written by the middle, it's in 5 or 6 or 7 different languages simultaneously. And if you read it, there's no way 2 people can walk away with that book with having even remotely close to the same interpretation, unless you knew exactly what was going through James Joyce's mind. So, at least that's my perspective. Maybe I'm not as intelligent as some people who claim to understand texts like that. But nevertheless, I think that the issue comes down to, in communication, we need something better as far as how we relate to each other. And I don't know the answer to that. Jacques has speculated upon issues like that, but I don't think he can tell you exactly what it is. In time, I think we'll get out of the romanticism of our language, and we'll move into something, we'll just move into something that makes more sense. We'll find logic and reason to be more of a powerful way of informing people and each other about things. And a lot of the gestures, a lot of the superstitious-based orientations, comments like you have the right to your own opinion, which is a logical fallacy, uh, issues that words and terminology that has no meaning will finally kind of move away. Freedom, use buzzwords that are temporally defined that everyone seems to have a different notion of, and they get behind these words and concepts as though they understand them because they're manipulated by society usually to propagate the ideals, even though there's no real justifiable basis for them tangibly. I hope that makes sense. Uh, that's what I hope we move towards. It's taking the scientific train of thought and applying it to how we communicate. And I'm not sure how that's going to work on everyday communication, but I know when it comes to the approach to society holistically, there has to be a way to do it. And it does exist. It's just a way of reapplying the scientific method towards language itself. Granted, each word is defined by other words. There's always the ambiguity as far as language itself, words are defined right now, but we'll have to see. I wish I could answer your question in a more thorough way. That's just beyond the scope of things right now. And generally speaking, I think we have a lot more to deal with before we can address language in this way. One final point, before I stop rambling on this, is in The Best That Money Can't Buy by Jacques Fresco. He does have a whole section on language, and I think he does a very good job of describing the issues at hand and as far as and proposing what change could be possible. So check out that section. Number 7. People keep asking me how we get from here to the transition plan physically. Can you help how to answer that issue? Because my first answer is through education, and that seems to not be enough for most people. Let's see here. Well, I think I've talked about this a few times. The transition begins with a shift in values and an increase in understanding what is technically and scientifically possible on this planet and within the human species. In other words, and within human behavior. We have tons of ignorant restrictions that have been perpetuated in our minds to assume that A, there's no food, not enough food to feed people. B, it's a set human nature. Religion's done a great job of making people believe that good and evil, and that some people are just bad, some people are good, and that's that. And you can throw these people in prison or execute them, and these other people deserve this, this, and this. And these types of distortions have to be overcome on some level before any kind of real physical transition can begin. More beyond that, in time, as denoted, a research facility will be established, and this will be very important. The Venus Project, as it exists in Florida, is a first step in that. However, the next step is really something that's much more high tech on some level. We have to show how this stuff will operate. We have to get people to walk into the facility and say, "Wow!" Even if it's a miniature version of it, and say, "Wow, this really can work. We really do have the ability to do this. Why are we bothering with our current outdated system? Why do we have war? Why are 1 billion people starving to death on the planet?" These are the questions that will be raised in people's minds once they become aware of the possibilities that we've denoted. So that's the first step. And then once that type of interest is generated and the numbers come high enough, then we start to put pressure on the established orders. And that can't be talked about right now because it's complex and it's controversial. And I would say forms of protest are certainly relevant, but it could go far beyond that. There could be rejections of the system. This is something I'm not willing to go into right now because it's not worth speculating upon, and I don't want people to get the wrong idea and start putting forward aggressive moves towards the establishment when they can't get away with it. The only way you're going to get away with certain types of moves against the establishment is when you have the numbers behind you to do so. And as a general example, which I've given before, if you live in America and you have the federal income tax, if 51% of the U.S. population, probably not even that actually, it's 35%, I suspect, of the U.S. population refuse to pay their income taxes, there's nothing the government could do. They wouldn't have the power. They don't have the people to go through and audit and sue every single person. That would be 100 million people, 110 million people. They wouldn't be able to do it. They would have to revise the system. And that's the type of power that is necessary. And I apologize if that seems far-fetched, but it's only far-fetched if you decide it is. Number 8, what about Z-Day? Any news? Zeitgeist Day I was attempting to have in two different events, two different venues, excuse me. One very large event which would gain public attention. Again, this is about gaining public attention. We need to have something that the press can't ignore. So I was considering a theater that exists in Madison Square Garden called the WAMU Theater at MSG, and basically the size is a bit high for the poll that I put out, and the cost is quite extensive, and I'm not moving forward with that right now because I don't think we're there yet. If I could get the third film out before March 15th, maybe it could happen, because I have a much more vast promotional scheme for the third film. Try and pull this thing out of the underground. We have to get into more of a mainstream issue for people on the general public level, so to speak, take us seriously, as much as I hate it. But nevertheless, two venues are most likely, probably a venue which has about a 1,500 person capacity for the main event, and I'm hoping for a secondary venue which will be something of an expo to show through plasma screens and models and various contributions of other members that have creative interests what is possible, and various research as well. So there could be a section of a room on scholarship, which denotes statistical research that denotes, say, the carrying capacity of the Earth as we understand it. I know research is continually happening in different walks, but it really hasn't been put together in one place. We have to continue to present our case to the public so they understand it thoroughly. And excuse me. And that's really it. I mean, it's Zeitgeist Day 2010. I hope to be as big as possible. It's unfortunate I can't get the new film out most likely before then, but we'll see what happens and see if we can keep the interest going for that. But I do intend it to be large, and it's not just Zeitgeist Day in New York. And I want everyone to understand that. While that is an important thing, I really want people to work in their own areas as well. Even if maybe you don't have a major press outlet cover you, but if you had tons of minor press outlets cover multiple events, well, that's just as powerful. That's just as informative, and it's something that's unprecedented. And I think the major outlets, once aware of that, would not be they would be forced to cover something. At least I think some of them would, the less controlled ones. But I'll keep you guys updated on that. Number 9, Peter, in your last radio address, you said that pro-life people, if they were serious about the prevention of killing children, would not just talk about abortion, but would go to every military recruitment center in the country. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that and how exactly religion plays a role in pro-lifers against abortion, but not against war, as well as why the pro-life conservatives only preach about not killing infants, but seemingly don't care when you are 19 and perfect for the and simply don't care when you are 19, perfect for the military, and perfect for the military to manipulate you. Sorry, I read that poorly. I think George Carlin put it best. I think if I remember his quote, pro-life Christians want live babies so they can grow up to be dead soldiers. And that's a very coarse way to put it, but the thing is the logic is absolutely there. I've yet to see a religious organization of any kind, whether Judaistic or Christian or Islamic, ever step forward and promote one of their most cardinal doctrines in all of them, which has to do with the murder of another human being. Obviously, there's weird stuff in each one as far as justifying it, but generally speaking, at least in the Christian sense, thou shalt not kill, that's very straightforward, the Judeo-Christian sense. Obviously, no one really seems to care about that, do they, in the religious circles, in the established religious circles? And it's just a simple way to point it out. I think you already know, based on the way you write your question, what I'm talking about. Pro-life, in its practice concept, as far as babies, is a complete logical fallacy. War is by far the biggest killer it's by far the biggest irrational killer of people, especially at this day and age. And you think that these organizations would step forward. Unfortunately, there's also this massive attribute of retribution and revenge that exists in all established religions. So it's, I guess, more convenient for them to target fetuses and claim their value as opposed to human beings that are actually in existence, that actually have real lives with relationships and are engaged in the environment. A fetus's only relationship is to its mother, and it's only the mother's decision to decide what to do with it. It's not the state's, no one else's. I think that should be clear enough. it's just sad that there's so much energy spent on that particular issue in these communities when, if the philosophical basis, if you cared about life, then you would be against so much of the establishment. If you were pro-life, you would want organic food. If you were pro-life, you would you would you would be against anything that has a negative attribute to your survival or the survival of somebody else, and that's the reality. Number 10. Jacques Fresco said that children will only learn physics, mathematics, chemistry, that is, things that are only useful in society, as he says. But what about sports, which can have an educational sense, for example, when the children learn to interact with each other and learn to deal with frustration if they lose? I think it is very important that children learn how to deal with their feelings and emotions as early as possible. Should it be a specific subject at school, dance, theater, sports can also contribute to this emotional education. I couldn't agree with you more. I wouldn't have to use the medium of sports to express that. It isn't sports or dance or those elements specifically which is needed. It's the children learning how to deal with emotions and not having them fall victim to all the ego issues that people endure today. I completely agree with you. People need to learn to stop valuing themselves by comparing themselves to others. Our commercial society thrives on comparison and competition. I'm nothing but horrified when I continually read about these stories of those that have been affected by the economic problems in the world, and have some of them that have been very well to do financially, and because they've lost their occupation, they go home and they kill themselves and their entire family. It's a severe emotional problem defined by their value and survival. And I think it's less survival because some of them are actually quite wealthy in the examples that I had seen. It's just that they've been manipulated to think their self-worth has something to do with their net worth. And I think that's just dramatic and dramatically aberrated. You know, some people, if you say that you don't have a job, some people say, "Oh, he's unemployed." To call somebody unemployed is almost a derogatory comment, isn't it? It's fascinating. You know, he's just an unemployed bum or something to that effect. Back to your point, though, self-improvement's the issue, and in education, that is what is regarded, not competition. And as far as dealing with the emotional issues, you, at a young age, absolutely, Jacques has talked about this a lot. People need to learn how to deal with their frustrations and possible jealousies that might emerge. People need to understand that everyone's different. No one can be the best at anything. In fact, there's no such thing as the best. It's impossible. There's always a build-up constantly through time, generation upon generation, where things are getting things grow and get better and better and better. It was the old Newton quote that I have accomplished what I have done because I have stood on the shoulders of giants. So these issues, I think, will be dealt with, and I completely agree with you. I wish I had more to add to that. I haven't given enough thought to that. But if I was to begin an educational curriculum, the first thing is that kids that are of a cognitive age, meaning that they can speak and they can write, they would learn scientific logic and reasoning, and they would learn how to address emotional reactions. They would learn not fairy tales. They would learn how to think clearly. Logic should be taught in elementary schools. Unfortunately, I think in some schools they might be, but very rarely. Usually it's only in college there's logic approach. Logic is not a complex thing. It doesn't have to be some massive intellectual exercise. But I think if kids were given that, they would be less prone to the superstitious elements. They'd be less prone to give in to the nonsensical notions of nonsensical rhetoric that you would typically see induced by a tradition, superstition. You know, good and evil is just a classic one that I like to throw out there. There's all sorts of issues like that. So I hope that helps. Here's another one that relates to language a little bit. Will we be allowed to speak the languages today, or will there be only a scientific language without room for any kind of interpretation? There's no rigidness like that, but let me continue. Plus, we don't even know what the scientific language is. I mean, it's just like mathematics. It's to the extent that you would hope that people would understand things and communicate. And the best way I can describe it is the ultimate form of logical reasoning, cause and effect. A equals B, B equals C, A equals C. Instead of just pontifications and things that people throw out there for their own ego issues, back to the prior question, people often defend themselves because they want to feel like they're correct because they've been taught that being wrong makes your worth less. They reject the idea that we're all constantly learning, and it's unfortunate that that's a staple. But let me continue with your question. I think the people's ability to think and build opinions have to be kept. So if there is a better school system which helps the people to become critical thinkers, and the people already learn the scientific method, many stupid opinions will become outdated very fast. They won't appear anymore if it happens, then really seldom. The scientific language can coexist with the nowadays language, which can be improved. I think I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you. You used the term opinions. There's a spectrum, I guess, of understanding. You have opinions on one side, and then you have tangible understandings on the other. Let me give you an example of what that might be. A tangible understanding is 1 plus 1 equals 2. I think that's fairly uniform. And an opinion on the other side would be saying somebody is say fat. Okay, you have a fat leg. We'll use that one. Sorry, that's a terrible example, but we're just going to assume that idea of something being fat has to have a relative sense. So, in other words, I could say someone has a fat leg, and someone else would disagree with me, and because we both have a relative sense of what that means, because we're thinking of some ideal. If I'm looking at Victoria's Secret's catalog, and then somebody else is looking at, standard newspaper full of normal people, obviously we might have different perceptions on education-wise, as far as reference, of what might be considered fat. So that's the other aspect. That would be fall under the guise of opinion. But beyond that, it's really not. How do I phrase this? There has to be a tangible frame of reference that's based on logic and rationale. So it wouldn't even be a question if somebody is perceived as being fat or not. There would be a scientific way of gauging that, and that train of thought would have to be assessed through logic and reasoning. Just like 1 plus 1 equals 2 is easily assessed because you can see that in the material world. So I hope that helps. It's a difficult topic, and it's something that I'm going to go into more so in the new film. There's a great book that I have, which just popped into my mind, and it's called Crimes Against Logic. And I recommend those out there to get a sense of this type of use of language, to get this book, Crimes Against Logic. I don't have it in front of me, but it's really good about addressing these specific issues. There's so many, in language, there's just so much nonsense. And again, I don't want to go on a tangent on this because we already kind of spoke about this, but you really have to begin to differentiate between nonsensical language and tangible language. I'll leave it at that. And as far as your question is concerned, all that stuff can coexist, but we want to hone in language so it's as rational as possible, so people don't have so much ambiguity when they're speaking, or when they're interpreting. Number 12. I'm glad to hear Fresco talk about. There's another language question. I should have combined these language questions. I'm going to go ahead and read it anyway. I'm glad to hear Fresco talk about inventing a different language. I believe our semantic environment is what creates a lot of the separation and hate and bias we have in our thinking. One of the biggest problems I find in our language is the way we label people based on actions or beliefs or physical appearances, etc. We're a Christian, or we're a Democrat, or we're terrorists, etc. And none of it means anything. It only corrupts the way we think of each other and ourselves. I'll stop you right there because I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, that's a fantastic example of the scapegoatism that you tend to find in language, the use of labels. I can't stand labels. We use them as forms of communication. All words are technically labels, but the broader oriented labels are really dangerous. We know that in the movement from people calling us communist and lots of other things. Rather than think about our train of thought, they just find an association and stamp on the label, and then they are satisfied because they don't have to think anymore. So your question continues, How vital do you think it is that we develop this new language first in order to begin thinking as one? Perhaps it could be suggested to somebody who is talented in creative writing to begin working on a narrative work of fiction that uses parts of this new language. That's an interesting idea. Again, I'd like to see that because I'm not sure how the language would materialize either in the sense of everyday conversation. Um, as far as language and beginning to think as one, a common language based on universals. Yeah, I don't know. This is again one of those complex questions. If someone can hypothesize, someone has the intellectual ability to hypothesize how language can be communicated in everyday, as me speaking on the phone right now, somehow being able to be clear enough where nearly all of you understand exactly what I'm saying, that would be a feat. There are many fallacies to our language, as noted previously. People still say the sun rises. They still say up when they should say out. There's basic fundamental things like that, which would be the first thing to get rid of. But interesting ideas. I'd like to see that. Number 13. I know this has been touched on in the past, but what will be the policy on guns in the event that someone did, for whatever reason, go on a shooting spree? What would be the course of action? More specifically, what will happen to sports like hunting? Well, the first part of your question, the question you're asking really isn't about guns. It's about motivation. I think this has been stated before. The concept of security is one issue that might motivate somebody to not want guns. They'll say, oh, we've got to get rid of guns and we'll be more secure. But that's really narrow. That's a really narrow idea in reality. If someone really wants to go out and kill a bunch of people, if they really want to do it, they will figure out a way to do it regardless of the availability of guns. So the question isn't, the policy on guns. That it doesn't mean anything. The question is, how is society organized so conflict is reduced in and of itself? So there's no motivation for conflict. And the second part of your question, what will happen with sports like hunting? I think hunting will eventually phase out and as a primitive hunting for no other reason. I mean, hunting for food, I guess you might have some sects that might be possible, but I'm not going to be. I can't tell you how things will work out in the transition at this stage. But generally speaking, I think hunting will be seen, arbitrary hunting for game will be seen as nonsensical, unnecessary, and unenjoyable and barbaric. Just like people being fed to lions in ancient Rome seem barbaric to us today. But, that would qualify, I suppose, as an opinion. But based on the pattern of development, I think that's a natural consequence. Is there a utility for killing things throughout a sport? There really isn't. The enjoyment is a value system adaptation, which has come from your parents or your society. If people are no longer motivated and they no longer see reward in that, then through time it will eventually just fade away. Through evolution, there will be no point to it anymore. Number 14. Peter, I work as a physicist, but in my spare time I study psychological operations performed by countries' militaries or secret services by using media, or through the media. I guess you mean influencing people through media. This is an age-old and well-developed science. The public's perception is guided, as you know, through repetition and familiarization. My question is this: why does the movement not invest more resources into the highlighting of this manipulation to the planet's population? Also, in the future, the movement will come under the very, very same type of attacks from these psychological operation programs. Yes, the media manipulation, of course, is very powerful. I think anybody listening knows that. People say to me, you can't change people. People think what they want to think. That's obviously not true. People change their opinions very quickly once the masses support those ideas. I just have to look again at the notion of terrorism, statistically irrelevant, yet the media establishments of the world had people on their knees staring, watching the little color-coded things, waiting for the next news of some new terrorist attack. People putting plastic on their windows out in the middle of the rural South because they're afraid of the boogeyman. So people were very much manipulated. I completely agree with you. As far as why doesn't the movement invest more resources into the highlighting of this, well, I think the Zeitgeist 1 and 2 have talked about this quite a bit, and I hope that others do as well. We are heavily influenced. The value systems that most of us share are pushed upon us because they support the establishment. It wouldn't work if we didn't support the values of the establishment, which is why greed and everything else is continually perpetuated. Vanity is continually perpetuated. Vanity, ideas of beauty. In New York subways, one billboard after another of new shows that are just based on absolute derogatory fashion issues. So it definitely continues, and that's how you keep the politicians in power, and that's how you keep the commercial industries afloat. You perpetuate the need for people to be insecure and to rely on this or that. Yes, and I agree with you that the movement will come under strong attacks in the future from psychological operations. That is just inevitable. But the thing is, we want things to be so airtight that that the train of thought is so powerful that those types of attacks will have no basis. You can't attack things. You can only attack things for so long in certain ways. The truth will eventually come through in some way. If people know that we have the ability to create an abundance and it can be shown on paper provably, then no rhetoric of some random Yahoo on the news denying that is going to do much. We're going to arrive at these conclusions. As long as, of course, the public is aware of those processes, and unfortunately many of them are not, and they're stuck in age-old value systems which would rather not think and just reject to preserve their own identity. But that's another topic. I'll stop rambling on that. Number 15, how will society start making projects as a community and not as a pyramid or hierarchy after the crash? Will the transition phase be hierarchical too? Well, organizational hierarchy is very different from socioeconomic hierarchy. You could say the Zeitgeist Movement or the Venus Projects is a hierarchy. I don't like to think about it that way. I think of it as an organizational structure. Obviously, you need point people to help and be liaisons to certain attributes. I think that's a better way to think about it. It's very, very different when you think about socioeconomic hierarchy because these are structural ramifications that people's options are extremely limited in regard to. When someone's born into poverty, statistically speaking, very much they remain in poverty. Someone's born into wealth, statistically speaking, very often they remain in wealth. And there are, of course, many reasons for that. I won't go into here. There was some information on that in the UK presentation. We want to transition from socioeconomic hierarchy to a more egalitarian system. The central idea is that economic worth, no one has greater economic worth than anybody else. The only hierarchy, if you want to use that term, would be sort of a skill hierarchy. It would be the effect that people that are very accomplished in certain mediums, say someone who is extremely advanced in aerodynamics, we would want their opinions on how to do certain things. That's different. Education, again, it goes back to the age-old notion of a democratic notion that I'm entitled to my own opinion. Well, and this is slightly an aside, but I want everyone to consider this democratic fallacy out there. The fact, imagine having surgery in remember, I'm sure you guys have seen those. You guys have seen those instances where you have an audience watching a surgery. You'll have like an open heart surgery, and there's people surrounding behind glass walls, and they're all watching the surgery. Usually they're med students, but sometimes the public can come too, or family members, or what have you. Imagine if it was a democratic situation, and the surgeon was just going to stand there and wait for everyone to vote on the next operating move. Imagine what a disaster that would be. So you have your aunt up there in the corner, and she's punching into some digital voting mechanism that she wants the doctor to cut the third artery, not the second artery, whatever. Do you see the problem with that? That is the thing that is most difficult to communicate with people that have this obsession with their own opinions in democracy. Everyone's opinion is not equal. People have to learn in certain ways. People learn in certain ways, and they become more proficient in certain mediums than others, and that's just the way it is. That is the nature of, and that's why working together is so critically important. Instead of the individualism, there has to be a socialism, not socialism by your general definition. people need to begin to see each other as extensions and work together. Many more brains are much more successful than just one. There's no reason that you can't have multiple Da Vincis working together. It's the society that um, restricts the upbringing of people. I mean, there's even Fresco will tell you that there could be many Frescos. It's the upbringing and the different way that they've been culminated, that his life experience has been culminated. So I believe I've absolutely deviated from your question. I guess I was relating this notion of hierarchy to the fact that hierarchy will not exist in the sense we have it today. It will exist in the sense of skills, but that's not really a hierarchy at all. It's a social organization. I think that's the best way to put it. The transition from our current establishment to a new system will most likely have some ramification of the old system. But in the end, the goal is to have an egalitarian structure where everyone has access to the same thing. I mean, obviously, there are certain issues that will come into play. It's not a utopia, but the idea is strong. And as denoted in the UK presentation, the most stable societies are the most peaceful and the most healthy societies are the ones that are more egalitarian oriented. All the materialism we see today as a part of capitalism is just that, material. It's good on one side, it's technologically progressive, it's definitely helped things, but there's no reason you couldn't have a minimalistic society as well that could be more happy. Things have become extremely complex in modern society, way beyond anything that's even remotely necessary, from taxation to financial burdens to the absolute emotional stresses that dominate almost every household. None of that is really necessary. So I'm going to stop rambling on that. I hope I made my point clear enough. Number 16, how is the declaring of resources as humanity's common heritage to come about? I mean, it must happen after we have enough technological solutions for decision making, like cybernetic systems all set up, and at least a vague idea of what to do when something goes wrong. The common heritage of all resources is a poetic declaration that everyone on the planet will have to come to understand. It's when you finally remove all of the property orientations. Property isn't real. It never was. No one owns anything, and to think someone does is a massive contradiction of logic. It's not there. It's just going to keep being transferred. It's relatively finite. It has no basis. You're going to die. It's going to be gone. It just keeps moving hands as though it has some real basis. It's time to stop the moving of hands and just having it as a common shared attribute. How will that come about? Well, it's going to take, in the transition, people are going to have to force it on some level, and they're going to have to be willing to accept it. I mean, I can't think of anything more beautiful than the common heritage of all the world's resources and the general mutual respect of those resources and everything that comes along with that. So the technological solutions for decision making are relevant, but they're not necessarily relevant to that specific idea of common heritage coming about. That's a different element. The cybernetic systems will help delegate and regulate in an absolutely non-biased way the distribution of resources in the most efficient way of using them and dealing with scarcity that might arise, allocating resources to specific industrial bases that require it, to different cities that require it anytime there's a shortage. So let me make sure I addressed your question thoroughly. Something goes wrong. If something was to go wrong in the systems, there would be redundancy as well. You don't need one single server. You'd have multiple servers that are mirroring each other that would be on separate lines. So if there was a problem, it could be assessed, and there could be so many fail-safes. Once you guys understand that redundancy really could be the backdrop of everything, to the effect where technological errors could become so rare because you could have 6 or 7 times redundancy. I've used the example of a plane before. Imagine having a plane instead of with 2 engines, with 4 engines, each engine running at 50% capacity. If 2 of the engines go out, then the other 2 engines go to full percent capacity. The probability of all 4 engines going out is very slim, especially if you're not making planes to sell, you're making them to last using the best resources imaginable. You could have 6 or 7 autopilots, each one with you could have the main pilot, and then you have 6 or 7 forms of redundancy for the autopilot. You could have a car that has a wheel that if the tire goes out, you have a secondary wheel that's built into the wheel, which will enable that car to drive smoothly to a safe location, not just be stuck on the side of the street. There's so many elements of redundancy that is unaffordable in this system. It becomes really insulting when you see how unsafe our society is. And just the general design, I'm not even going to go into all of that. Even to this day, when I drive down the street in North Carolina, where I'm from, and I'm going on the street that you can go 60 miles an hour, and you're passing cars that are about 2 feet from you. And people wonder why car accidents is one of the leading causes of death in America. I mean, we have a design where the streets, you're literally a few feet from head-on collision perpetually. I find that just fascinating that people are like, what are we doing? I mean, granted, I'm amazed there aren't more accidents than there are. Why? Because there's no money to create that type of safety. There's no money to separate it slightly, put a median, or put magnets in, or do some form of orientation. There's just not enough money to make the world safe, and it's completely ignorant and asinine. Excuse me, it's not ignorant. It's just obnoxious when you step back and realize how absurd it all is, how restricted and paralyzed we are by this system. Anyway, I'll stop rambling on that. Number 17. On his lecture, Jacques stated that most of the problems are technical. What do we do with those that aren't technical? Could you give an example? Well, I would have to declare, as far as I understand it, everything is technical. I really can't think of anything that isn't technical. And if someone for the next broadcast wants to send in something they feel is not technical, please do so. Technicality is the ultimate foundation of just about any action or any product or service. My thought process of answering these questions is based on the information that's been put into my brain. I am using using logical reasoning as best I can to come up with answers for these questions. Everything I'm doing is a technical process, and in advanced abstraction, there's no reason that all of these questions could not be answered by a machine much more efficiently than I can. The problem is the language and the communication. I'm not going to go into all of that. The database, cybernetic database that we've talked about, the computerized database that's denoted in the Activist Orientation Guide, talks a little bit about an artificial intelligence. Ray Kurzweil is another good one to talk about these things. We've had many instances where, well, I'm not even going to go into all of that because it's a long-winded subject, but nevertheless, I believe everything is technical. Obviously, the creation of any type of product is purely technical. You want peak efficiency. You want the highest optimization of resources. You want to make sure those resources are not highly scarce. And if they are scarce, you have to come up with a different form of distribution to make sure you don't run out of those resources, or make sure you have substitutions that are available. And then you create the product in the most peak efficient way you possibly can based on known methods at the time. Obviously, we have Moore's Law. We have things constantly being outdated by new technological understandings. That's always going to be a constant. But there's no reason we can't constantly be efficient in the highest form of efficiency right now, and that's all a technical process. So I hope that answers your question. I can't think of anything that isn't technical. I know that's unromanticized, but it really is the case when it comes to getting things done. If you want to restrict art is not a technical process. Art is more of a process of discovery. It's more of an intuitive process, if you will. It's one thing to build, say, a model that's up to scale and as accurate as possible. Some might call that art or an artistic creation, but really you're doing a technical process. A lot of people, for example, look at Jacques' work and say, wow, it's very artistic, and it very much is. It's very creative, but he can also explain to you why all the attributes in that picture are what they are. And they look artistic because they look foreign. And because it's foreign and it seems obscure, people think, oh, it must be just artistic. But no, there's actually reasoning behind things that people do. Reasoning behind things that often look advanced and out there. And, Jacques' renderings and models are very much in line with that. There's a reasoning behind it. They're very much technical structures. The artistic impression is really something that's a byproduct. And that whole subject is very, very interesting. Doesn't mean everything has to be absolutely uniform. There's always a threshold. You want variance. You want there to be stimulus in our environment to have new inspiring things. But as far as actual tangibles of society, it's all a technical process. If I want to get something done, it's going to be a technical process. It's not going to be me wishing or interpreting my dreams or praying for it. It's going to be something that can be done in a technical manner. It's thought about correctly. Number 18, on your last radio broadcast, you said initially machines will make basic decisions and tasks, and only later, when cybernetic technologies are more advanced, will they start to replace humans making decisions. Right. Now, based on the fact Jacques has said several times that there's no such thing as democracy, and that a true democracy would have 5,000 political parties, and we couldn't decide on anything, and that is always a dictatorship of the rich elite, is transition phase going to be a dictatorship of the rich elite until we have cybernetic decision-making systems in place? Hope everyone followed that. Well, no, dictatorship of the rich elite does not have to always be there in the transition phase. There can be other forms of movement outside of that. You could have a step-by-step path where things were socialized, if you want to use that term. You could have all energy be made free through automated systems distribution and mining. That could easily happen if they wanted to do it, but unfortunately the energy industry is a cartel, and it makes outrageous amounts of money off of their preservation of scarcity. As far as your initial question, I'm a little confused on your train of thought. As far as democracy, the decisions of democracy, well, the decision-making process goes to people that are educated in those fields through interdisciplinary teams. You contribute, and you volunteer your time, and you work with a computerized system initially, most likely, to present your ideas. The ideas are initially improved through artificial intelligence and then sent to other people if necessary. Then you become part of that decision-making process. Everyone can contribute, but it's all based on how much information you have. The computer system can quickly recognize if if a particular person is not aware of a particular advancement that's already been made, and it can correct them. I think it's a very powerful way to consider how decision-making processes can be arrived at in a new system when you consider that angle. And as far as the first part of your question, replacing humans, computers, cybernetic technologies replace human decision-making. I think I already addressed that. It will replace human decision-making in the most technical aspects. It's not some kind of control mechanism where they just decide what everybody does. It's not like that. It's not Orwellian in that sense. It's much more clinical than that. But who knows what the future holds as far as where artificial intelligence can go. There's a lot of information on that out there, speculative and some based on scientific extrapolation. That's certainly fascinating to read about, but it's beyond the scope of what we're concerned with now. It's not necessary for us to worry about that right now. Number 19. What about dentistry and the like? Who will cut your hair? These occupations can't really be automated right now. Who would take up these occupations? They certainly aren't fun jobs, nor are they intellectually stimulating. Who would want to put in the long hours to do these jobs? Well, in the transition, people are going to be continuing to do what they do. It's a matter of understanding where we're going. It's a matter of shifting society towards the focus of automation as opposed to the focus of just helping people now. Automation focus is not liberal enough. It's not deliberately working to replace people. That's what we want it to be. As far as dentistry, medical stuff, there's so much amazing technology out there already that is helping with those fields. In time, I think preventive dentistry will be so powerful that the need to go to a dentist will probably be non-existent. There could be certain things that could be done that far exceed what most people think about. I mean, we think about a dentist as being a commonplace thing. Well, what if in your infancy you were able to get a particular type of coating for your teeth that could be applied technically, be applied by whatever means, it doesn't even matter. And for the rest of your life, unless you undergo some dramatic problem, you don't ever have to go to a dentist. Is that out of the question? I think not. I think there's a lot of things that would make a lot of the service industries and medical industries irrelevant. People would no longer be as sick as they are today because they wouldn't have all the cancer-causing agents and all the stuff that goes on today. They wouldn't have all the pollution of the water supply. They wouldn't have all the stuff that makes them constantly sick and requiring the necessity of surgery and doctors that we see today. So I hope that helps. I think it's a multi-angled answer, but I ultimately think once the shift towards automation occurs, those occupations that do require human work, will be done gladly because there'll be it'll be so much more of a pleasant environment. I'd be more than happy to fulfill an obligation to monitor, say, a factory plant for a couple hours a day and do my part for society, the society that we've created, the society that everybody is a part of. And that's the train of thought. It's not that some people don't get to do something and some people have to do something. That's not the way it works. You're going to see an entirely new incentive and value system. Again, back to Margaret Mead, I think she denoted how most people, things that they really remember is helping. It's helping others. It's what they really consider to be the most important. It's not their 9-to-5 jobs. They like to do things for their own satisfaction, and I think that's really going to be the most powerful incentive in the future. And there's plenty of precedent for that. Number 20. Peter, I just want to know why people have such a hard time realizing what this movement is all about. I don't understand how people don't see this as common sense. I'll stop you right there. I completely agree. I think what we're denoting is of extreme practicality. He continues, or she continues, I think people might have psychological barriers set up and just automatically reject this idea, which is so upsetting because they can't see how we can all be free and rid of the mindless jobs that we all need to survive today. I'll stop you right there. I couldn't agree more. Psychological barriers and ego identifications are extremely powerful. And not only the mindless jobs, but the overt, absurd atrocities of our society. It's not just we want to not have to work or something like that. That's not it at all. It's the atrocities of the system that make it so unbearable. It's the poverty and the war and the corruption and the distortion of the human mind and the human value system that is really the issue. He continues, she continues, maybe people don't even know how to begin to work together. I feel like there is a feeling in this country that if you accept help from somebody, then that means you are not as good as them and you are stupid. I'm going to stop you right there again. I couldn't agree with you more. The value orientations of rejecting the idea that we're all learning, as I denoted before, is extremely profound. People can't stand being proven wrong. And I mean, everyone falls victim to that. I've done very well to address that in myself. If I come up with an error, I do my best to deal with that error and not get emotional about it and acknowledge the fact that we are all learning constantly. Jacques Fresco was one of my biggest, he proved me wrong on so many different levels as far as my general worldview, and I had to step way back and reassess my identity and the way I looked at the world because it was very foreign to me, as most of this stuff is, and I hope that relates to your point. But let me continue finishing your question before I go any further. He continues, she continues. So I guess my question is, what is the best way to get through to people if it's even possible? Should I look for common ground type thing? I really need help to get through to people because I am really passionate about this, but feel so powerless. Well, common ground type thing, as you denote, is certainly the best way to go about it. You want parallel values to come forward. You want to utilize parallel values in whatever way that you can. But I completely understand. I've talked about that a lot, and I'm not going to go into it. Well, okay, very quickly, if you were to talk to someone who was a Nazi, you wouldn't talk about equality. Simultaneously, if you were to talk to an egalitarian Christian, you wouldn't talk about technology. There's certain things that are, well, technology in the sense, say it's a housewife you're talking to that doesn't know anything about technology. It might be difficult to relay that information, while the Nazi might have a more technical background. So you have to find common ground as best you can when you address people. Ultimately, you just have to really try to get them informed in the most simplistic level possible. And people always ask me this question. I kind of come up with something new to say. In my general experience, when I talk to people about this stuff, I can usually get them to a point where they start to ponder it. And that's really where you want to stop. You don't want to give them directives and say, this is this and that's that. You want to say, well, consider this, consider this, consider this, and consider that. And eventually you'll see a question mark go off in their mind. And that's really where the ponderance, that's really what you want. You want them to begin to ponder what you're describing. That's the best thing I can suggest to you, but I understand your frustration. You got to give them the information. I'm constantly trying to put out as much information as I can. Show them the lecture, show them the economic system and what it is, show them what it produces, show them all the information. That's all I can say. You just have to do your best and be creative about it. Take different routes with different people. Number 21, what would be done with pets? I believe that companionship is very important to many people. Do you think people will still keep domestic animals? I see no reason why not. There's nothing to think that's a problem. Pets interspecies relationships, I think, are very positive things. Number 22. Hi, Peter. What's your point? What's your viewpoint? Excuse me. What is your view? What is your viewpoint on the role of recreational drugs in a resource-based economy? Recreational drugs are not going to be made illegal or anything like that. That will just send them underground. The issue is really just to decrease the motivation for most people's use of recreational drugs. I really don't have an opinion on that. I can't say that things like that will just vanish. I think there might be something to recreational drugs that people enjoy. I don't know. It's more to the effect that the focus on escapism in this culture is quite powerful, and I think that's what we have to get away from. People should preserve their health and want to preserve their health. Any type of drug that's detrimental to your health is certainly not a good idea. So that's something to keep in mind. But there's no restriction. I don't know what the view would be. I think there'll be freedom to do just about anything in that regard, but there will be a general social consensus that won't want to see people destroy themselves. They won't want to see people overdose on heroin. These things will become aberrant conditions, or people that are just addicts. Any kind of addiction is, of course, a terrible thing. Anything in moderation is fine. I mean, coffee is theoretically a recreational drug. People don't consider it that way, but that's really what it is. Caffeine. So, it's just the train of thought and the frame of reference. I don't see it as a dramatic issue. I think the model that's used in Holland is just as applicable. Number 23, I'm assuming that in this new resource-based economy, war and weapons will no longer be needed. Won't we still need a global defense system against foreign invaders to our planet? It's highly unlikely, but still possible. I'm afraid this new nonviolent society will be our demise. Though we won't have greedy humans on the planet, we can't rule out greedy aliens. We will still need weapon development. That's funny. I'm not laughing at your question. I just envisioned a bunch of aliens with big dollar sign bling and cruising around in Lexuses. As far as the alien issue, that's not viable, I think. And there's so many variables in life. If that's not necessarily relevant. What I would say is that if there was a meteor that was headed towards the planet, by all means, you need a defense system to help something like that. Any type of defense system that is in defense of the planet itself is acceptable. Unless we get into more of an enlightened point. I mean, assume there was an alien species. I think, throwing out defense is the worst initial thing that you could do. If there was a threat and it was made apparent, then fine. But I have a feeling that any organism that's traveling many, many light years, most likely to get to this planet, is going to have such a high intelligence that the last thing they're going to be considering is killing us. That's just our projection of our own fears based on our primitive mentality. Number 24. I keep hearing traditional people speak of the yellow dragon and the new economic empire, referring to the Chinese. Apparently the Chinese are creating an image that they're becoming the strongest country economically. Is that true? Why or why not? And what do you think will happen? What do you think we should do about it? Well, there's nothing to do about it. China is definitely on pace. I believe they've already surpassed Japan, and I don't see any reason why they're not going to pass the United States. I believe they hold $2 trillion of our debt. So they have us on a shoestring in a lot of ways. You got to remember, the United States outsources so much. I mean, China does so much production. China is a production hub. I don't agree with China's practices. They have so many different social problems. Authoritarianism. China is outright authoritative. The United States is covertly authoritative. The thing about China I think is interesting, and I'm throwing this out there for something you consider, is the fact that because there's state control of the state control monopoly over specific enterprises, I believe that they have much more, what's the word I'm looking for? They're much more efficient than the United States in the way in privatization of resources. I'm not supporting the idea per se. What I'm saying is that their organizational structure is more proficient. People often say, "Oh, the Soviet Union, that was what a horrible thing. That was just a big disaster." Well, remember, the Soviet Union was the second largest economic power on the planet. how did they get to be that way so fast? There's something to be said for a systems approach to organizing production in society. I'm not saying that justifies anything. There's many different atrocities. There's many problems. But larger order systems operations is really the way to go on any logical scheme, regardless of comparison of countries and social systems. China has successfully avoided, to a good degree, the global recession, from what I've read. And they seem to be growing, not shrinking, as opposed to the United States. So who knows? I mean, I think these types of moves are going to be learning experiences. That's about all I can really say about that. I don't see much of a need to pontificate about it, except maybe to look at what China's done that's made them economically successful or in a production sense, and to maybe learn from that, perhaps. I don't know. Privatization and the free-for-all free market system as it exists today is just a bunch of kids running around with greedy mentalities, and it's childish. And I think the creation of the United States economy has served a powerful role because of the dominance, that strategic dominance through the U.S. dollar and everything else that's been utilized to make the U.S. what it is. But I think it's finally starting to nip the shenanigans, so to speak, of the debt expansion, of the manipulation, of the covert empire expansion, has slowly come to destroy the country that destroy the United States. It's not sustainable, in other words. It's an arc. So anyway, I hope I answered that question. I'm not an authority on China, but I do find it interesting. Number 25, I believe one way to kickstart the transition process is through the promotion of energy microgeneration, meaning promote the idea that investment in energy self-generation, I assume you mean renewable energy, would be a cheaper option for them in the long term. It would help to remove power from both the energy companies and governments as well as destroying one of the main reasons for war. Well, I agree with you. I assume you mean just the universal application of renewable energy so everyone is doing well. That's great, but that's going to destroy the profit margins of all the hegemonic corporations that currently run the world, such as the oil markets and such. So, I'm sure you can see the barrier there. I'm slowly running out of time here, so let me keep going. Number 26. Do you find any significance in the cultural revolution that took place in the 1960s? What sort of implications did this behavior unleash, and what conclusions could we draw from it and use to elevate social awareness? The 60s rebellion, so to speak, is similar to, I think, what's happened now. If you go back and look at the rhetoric of things like that, it was anti-corporatism, it was anti-government war, and a lot of the similar attributes. I'm not sure what happened, frankly. That's before my time. Somehow we went from that to this baby boom generation of very little rebellion, very little social upheaval. It seemed that all of the anti-establishment gestures of the 60s and 70s was commodified and repackaged and sold as products back to the people that used to fight for it. I think it was commercialized to a certain degree, but that's just a broad, huge question. I don't know what to say, generally speaking. I guess I'm slightly disappointed that we seem to be back at square one on a certain level, and the notion of anti-war protests suddenly have a derogatory thing with hippies and things like that. I don't know, but nevertheless, I find it certainly interesting. That's a very interesting question. What conclusions can we draw from it to elevate social awareness? I think learning about history in general to show what has sustained and what hasn't is very important. I think the gestures of the 1960s is very important. Again, the gestures, as far as actions and activities that need to be done, I didn't see. There was never a large scale operation that I think is still in existence. It's too bad. But number 27. What are your thoughts on Ray Kurzweil's law of accelerating returns and how it applies to such concepts as strong AI and technological unemployment? I feel such ideas like singularity, which is gaining serious traction in many influential circles dealing with technology, and a cyber-dated resource-based economy are mutually compatible. The singularity would seem inevitable simply because it fits the classic symptoms of an emergent technological phenomenon. Would it be possible to also field this question to Jacques and Roxanne about it as well? I can make a note to field that question to Jacques and Roxanne. I think last time we mentioned singularity, or I mentioned Kurzweil. As far as singularity, for those of you that don't know, very simplistically, singularity is denoting a point where artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence, where, well, that's basically it. I completely agree that it's mutually compatible, and I completely agree that it's an emergent technological phenomenon, and I certainly would say it's nothing to be feared. I don't know whether his numbers, Ray Kurzweil, are correct. He gives dates in that book, Singularity, and I don't know if I can buy that. It just seems like such a complex topic, but he's a very smart guy, and I certainly trust a lot of his other ideas, because a lot of them have actually very much come true. But, I think to simplistically answer your question, will artificial intelligence challenge and probably exceed human intelligence? I think so. There's no reason why it shouldn't. It's a technological process, and with nanotechnology and the ability to create powerful, extremely small computers, I think processing power is going to go to a level that is just beyond anything that anyone could ever imagine. All you have to do is look at the history of computers to see that, from 40-ton supercomputers that are now equivalent of a desktop or even a miniature desktop. So, interesting point, and I agree with you. And I'll ask Jacques on that question. I think I denoted that last radio show, though. So if you wanted to note that, you can point that out. In fact, Jacques' response, actually, I do remember now. Jacques' response to artificial intelligence is that we don't even need to consider that. While it's true, we don't need to consider that. We have enough options already. Whether the understanding of artificial intelligence at this stage is really enough for us to start and have a much more efficient society, even use the simply tools as opposed to design attributes, which I think is what you're implying. When we get to a point where machines can design things on their own and they can assess certain things on their own for the sake of the social well-being, that's going to be a very powerful stage. But even before that, we don't even require that necessity. We can use machines as tools in the meantime, using our brains, and get so much done. Number 28. Is this another language question? All right, I think it's another language question. Let me read it fast. I have heard both you and Jacques Fresco talking about a universal language, a mathematics-like language that could replace other language because of its superiority of understandability and unambiguous character. Personally, I think languages can also be forms of expressing art, like poetry, music. Languages are not only tools for communication. Thus, if you replace the free languages, don't you think you will also remove one aspect of free thinking and emotional expression? Also, if I understand you correctly, the new language would not necessarily need to replace the old languages, but only serve as a powerful tool for communication, which could be used only for that purpose. My question is then, don't we already have a language like that, mathematics? Yes, we do. I addressed most of these points in the prior question on language. The issue of free thinking and emotional expression. Free thinking. What is free thinking? Free thinking is still a technical process, just having more variables. Rational thought and logic is based on variables. If people can think very rationally about extremely wrong things because they don't have enough information. I think a lot of people that misinterpret the Zeitgeist Movement do just that. They're very rational in their descriptions, but their information is so limited that the tools they're using, the input, so to speak, is too limited. So therefore, they don't see any other option because they're restricted to a rational train of thought based on limited information. Number 29. Hello, Peter. I would like to know your thoughts about society's psychological dependency on material and non-living things. I believe our psychological dependency towards cravings, addictions to gambling, internet use, overeating, self-injury, compulsive buying, or work addiction are some of the major problems with our society today. I agree. Trying to end the monetary system will not be an easy task. We are going to have to help those who have been psychologically dependent on this system. It is like trying to help and wake up millions of drug addicts. I couldn't agree with you more. That's exactly what it is in a lot of ways. The issue has to be dealt with through social therapy, as we've noted before. The sickness of the culture is certainly not underestimated. I'll grant you that. We have to find a way, and that's really what we've been talking about. We have to get people to reject the values of the system and to see through them, Just imagine for a moment if everyone just rejected the value system, the materialistic value system in and of itself. You know, I cringe when I see anybody walk into a Gucci store and buy a $400 pair of sunglasses. I mean, did they sit down with technicians and design the absolute most optimized lenses? No. They designed a style and they gave it a logo, and dumb people, went in and bought it. I hate to say dumb people, misled people that don't know any better, that have a value system that's been created and enforced by the system, don't know any better, and they blow money on stuff like that. It really is profound when you put it into perspective. Number 30, if I'm not mistaken, the Venus Project wants to sort of unite our human culture with technology to be in harmony with nature and with high technology at the same time. What is the Venus Project's approach to the different kind of pests, such as rats or snakes or spiders, and natural disasters, such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and storms, that might put people in risk, and its approach without interfering or hurting the environment? Let me understand you correctly. What you're saying is, how do we deal with problems that, the only problems that really exist are problems that are common to the whole of humanity. The whole of humanity has to be utterly symbiotically recognized, has to be symbiotically referenced in regard to the environment. That statement made no sense, but we'll roll with it. In other words, we have to understand how we're interconnected. It's not just species elitism, but there is, of course, the human species as the forefront and everything in our environment to support the species. I can't really think of any other way it can work like that. It's not that, we need all of the other animals and vegetation and everything else on this planet. There's an enjoyment to the aspects as well. So as far as pests and stuff, I'm not quite sure what you mean. It goes back to the whole idea of sanctity of life. What is sacred in life? Life is just about everything, and it's really just a matter of social degree as far as what people consider to be sacred. I know tons of people that I was walking down the street the other day, and there was a seagull that had a broken wing, and all these people were crowding around trying to help the seagull, trying to figure out what to do with it. And right next to them was a dead pigeon, and I was sitting there wondering, would these people be just as interested in the seagull as they would be if the pigeon was still alive? Would they be running around trying to save the pigeon? And it's just something to think about as far as the relativity of how we consider what's valuable in life. I hope I'm understanding your question correctly. As far as natural disasters are one of the biggest threats. We'd have an entire campaign, entire project to figure out how to alleviate the pressure in the Earth's crust so that earthquakes don't exist, to figure out how to stop hurricanes from hurricanes and typhoons and the like to culminate. You'd be surprised at certain ideas of weather controlling and ways that could happen, at least specifically in certain regions. So that would definitely be an approach. As far as hurting the environment, all the retroactive elements are taken into account immediately. That's a huge part of this. We don't do anything without understanding what it's doing to the environment. So if a specific technology is creating pollution, for example, which is the very common thing we see today, it wouldn't be done unless there was absolutely no other option. And even if there was no other option, every effort would be made to make sure that pollution is minimized as much as possible. So anyway, the negative retroactions are always taken into account. Number 31, you may not agree with me, but it seems to me that marriage has become, over the last decades, more of a religious and political profitable business rather than a contract of two people in love. And at the same time, the government tries to seem moral, going against critical aspects of love and sexuality. In your opinion, how would you define love, sex, and marriage in a resource-based economy? If marriage will no longer be needed, on what basis will people decide to fall in love or have children? That's a vast question. First of all, marriage, from what I understand, in fact, this was communicated to me from Jacques, and it makes perfect sense. Marriage is a social institution that's been generated for control, so parents would take care of their children, and this makes perfect sense. The biblical orientations are on one side, but I would imagine that the gesture came long before the religious texts were written. People are reproducing. They always have, obviously. So when a child is produced, it would seem that in certain ways, maybe the child in a society would be pawned off on society. Excuse me. A child is produced, the couple doesn't pay attention to it, they're pawned off in society. Society doesn't like that, so they set up a system to make sure that the parents must take care of their children. I think that's really the fundamental relationship of marriage. If you want to look at marriage in a romantic way, that's up to you to do so. I certainly don't. I see it as a contrived institution. Religion has supported it to perpetuate its values, and it's created a whole fictional thing around it. Political stuff, that they just do it for value identification to continue to be elected because it is the dominant ethos. As far as how I would define love, sex, and marriage in a resource-based economy, it's whatever it wants to be. It's not that I can define it for you. I'm not in a position to do that. That's far too complex. Marriage most likely will be phased out because there won't be the legal ramifications to support it. So there won't be the tax write-off. There won't be all of those things. There won't be people won't need, I don't know, is marriage a form of insecurity or a form of dedication? That's something to think about. If two people really care about each other, what does it mean for them to get married? Yeah, so I think that answers your question. I hope it does. Number 32, imagine that it's been more than 100 years since the Venus Project became a reality, but there were some of these big corporation leaders that somehow escaped and have outcast themselves, and they are trying to bring back the monetary system. How do you think the Venus Project would prevent a scenario like this to happen? We have to consider all kinds of possibilities even worse than this. I assume your question is, what if there are people that want to bring back the monetary system? Well, once the transition was to occur, there would be absolutely no interest to bring back a monetary system. If I was to think in general about it, I would say maybe you could have a system of two people bartering if they wanted to for something under the surface, something so obscure. But, just like the Amish exist today, which very much reject most of modern society, in the event people still had moderate lifestyles where they engaged forms of trade, maybe that could be accounted for on some level. Is it really necessary? No. I think the systems approach to society will create such a different world where people will be they will understand it, they will enjoy what it's produced, they will contribute to it, and they will be supported by it. Their interests will not go towards themselves, their interests will go towards the system, and I think that the value shift will be unstoppable. There'll be no turning back at that point. That's sort of like saying that people will eventually just go back and live with caves and beat women over the head with clubs and drag them by their hair back to the caves. By the way, I have no idea if that's actually historically true. I just made note of that in cartoons. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm sure there are other instances where the other nonsensical, primitive instances that people would say the same argument. Like, what if people wanted to do this primitive act? I mean, in society today, very few people can say track animals. There's very few people that, well, actually, that's not true. There's some people that can do that. In modern society, technological society, we have moved out of all of the earlier notions that would have been considered socially acceptable, say, 5,000-6,000 years ago. And that's really just the pattern you have to be aware of. I don't think there's any turning back. Once we get out of the monetary system and abundance is created, people will not even know what the hell money was ever for. They'll wonder what the people were even thinking back in our time to create this ridiculous system of reward and scarcity rather than creating a holistic system to take care of everybody. They'll be baffled. But they'll accept it as a natural train of evolution. They'll study it in history class, and all the little kids will laugh. Number 33. But my question is, if we unite the whole world in the Venus Project, would cultural backgrounds be gone too? Not all cultural values are based on vague superstitions. Some are worth keeping, most of them don't. Perhaps the right question is, if the Venus Project becomes a reality, would it be a one-world culture? That's an interesting question. No, not at all. People will have value systems that relate in some way toward the common goal. They will be much more unified than they see today. But one world culture is just far too extreme, and it reeks of Orwellian uniformity. No, I think creativity and personal development and social development will be absolutely powerful. You'll see a great deal of diversity, but people will be alike in certain ways. They'll be alike in the ways that they will understand the system. They will understand the common goal. They will work towards society, work towards the betterment of society and not themselves, because that's where things come from. They will They will despise war, and they will despise dishonesty, and all the things that are supported and glamorized today. They will despise violence. If you really look closely at the culture we have today, there really isn't that much diversity, at least in the pockets of the West. You can look at general cultural diversity as far as tribal things like that. But in the West, people say there's a lot of cultural differences. Is there really? Is it? I mean, look at all the movies that come out. Are they not all virtually the same as far as the mainstream ones? Do they not have all the same character? Are people not all walking around as carbon copy manipulations of the materialistic world that's been imposed upon them? I think culture will flourish in a much more vast and interesting way than it does today. So no, I completely disagree. I don't think it would be a one world culture at all. They will share common values, but there will be a great deal of variation, probably more so than you can even imagine today. But it'll be based on logical trains of thought, and that's really the issue, not whims of superstition and assumptions that have no basis, no fades. You know, they'll come from somewhere tangible. Number 34, Peter, it disturbs me that you completely ignored the scientific process in selecting the Venus Project as your answer to the what do we do question. I may be wrong, and maybe you actually went through a complex scrutiny of many options, but if this is so, I have not read nor heard anything about these options. Before putting all your eggs in one basket, wouldn't the scientific method insist that you take a step backwards and reanalyze the root process options? I've analyzed the Venus Project until my brain is tired, and I think you are wrong to suggest that this is an option without an all-out legitimate transition phase to buffer the initiation. I think you're asking two different questions there. Well, first of all, the Venus Project, when I learned of the Venus Project, I did a great deal of analysis, and thing is, the root causes are very much presented. The root causes are the foundation of it. The root causes of government organization, the root relevance of a governing organization. What is it? A systems approach. The root organization of production methods. Do we need lots of third-party corporations competing against each other, making crappy things so they can continue to maintain market share based on demographic isolation? Or do we have a system where everyone works together to make peak efficiency? The latter makes perfect sense to me. Human conditioning. Human beings are not set robots wired with inherently aberrated annotations. We are biosocial machines, and as far as our values and our actions, generally speaking, while chemicals can influence it, it's a product of culture. All of these attributes were pivotal in my analysis of the Venus Project, and I think they are near empirical. So your question to me should really be addressing specific points, not just hyperbolating about my lack of the scientific method in analysis. Is anything perfect? Absolutely not. This is the best example of anything I've seen that denotes a true systems approach to society for the welfare of every human being on the planet. As far as your second question, legitimate transition phase to buffer the initiation, the transition phase is always in ponderance. That, of course, is a very difficult question, and you're going to have to be patient with that. If I knew all the attributes of the transition phase, well, then I would certainly write about it. Believe me, out of all the questions that I get, the transition is the most common. And rather than ask that question, people need to start thinking about it for themselves. And again, as I addressed earlier in the presentation, it comes down to value systems first. So I hope that helps with your disposition. Number 35. I'd like to know more about how the Venus Project is going to deal with public transportation, such as overcrowding, since in the resource-based economy system no money will exist. How are we going to deal with the large number of people traveling today? Sometimes the buses are overcrowded. I believe we would see more crowds of people in airlines in a resource-based economy without having them worry about paying for it. They would do it more often and make a lot of unnecessary long-distance trips, causing more traffic and crowds in public transportation systems. Well, I question whoever wrote this, if you saw Zeitgeist Addendum, the first thing we would do is phase out planes entirely. They're too slow. They cause far too much pollution. Maglev trains could be built with tunnels that go under all oceans. It could go overland, of course, as well. You'd have massive central hubs. They can go between 1,000 and realistically 4,000 miles per hour, depending on the the inertia the overcoming of inertia with the distances required to gain that type of speed. And of course, there's other technical aspects that could be denoted as far as that, but we want to move out of that means of transportation. And I think, generally speaking, if the focus is on making extremely efficient, fast transportation, instead of having all these random cars just laying about, clouding the streets, making it difficult to drive, if anyone's ever been in New York City, you know what a extreme nightmare it is with the lack of surface transportation. You could easily revise all of that if you wanted to, where you'd have, for lack of a better expression, certain types of trolleys and conveyors that would bring people anywhere. You'd have all you have to do is think creatively about what would be possible as far as making mass transit systems extremely fast and efficient and very comfortable. I don't see it as a problem at all. I see our current system as outrageously inefficient. I can't stand traveling, not because I don't like being in other places, it's because I just can't stand the airports. There isn't a time when I go through airport security that I don't have to bite my lip because of the absolute arrogance and the demeanor that these people have been conditioned into having, to be as rude as possible and to make you feel as uncomfortable and as suspect as possible when you're walking through their little airport security dominance field. There's such a massive problem right now on many levels of transportation that could be overcome very, very easily with much more efficient means. That could go on many different points on that. For example, there's this thing called zip cars that's in a lot of major cities now, and what it is a rental system based on cars. And if you get a zip car, if you need a car, it's for short-term stuff. You can rent them for a number of hours as opposed to renting a car for a day. And basically, you find out where it is, you go to it, you get the car, you do it, and then you return it to a specific location. Well, as many of you might know, we do have GPS tracking technology that can drive cars. So all you do is you take the concept of the zip car, you get rid of every automobile, and you set up a statistically oriented set of automobiles for each region, and you have them all tracked by GPS. You give them all Doppler so they can't hit anything, and you have them drive to your house when you order them. You go where you need to go. You don't drive it. It does it for you. It's perfectly tracked, and then it returns you where you need to go after you're done, and then it goes back to its central hub, or it goes to the next person that needs the car. You would see a reduction of automobiles in every major city by about 90% if that was the case. And the congestion would be gone. So keep that in mind. Number 36. In regard to planning the Zeitgeist Day 2010, it would be worth spending some time planning to have someone else who's an expert in sign language. They could stand next to you on stage, and deaf people from around the world can get involved. That's a beautiful idea. Either that, or you have you take the pre-recorded one and you get someone to do sign language on video, and you have them on the screen in a box. That would be post-edit, of course. You couldn't do that live. Well, you could do it live if they were on stage or you had another camera. But that's a great idea. And I think that's of course, having it set up like the UN where you have automatic translators as well would be a good idea too. It's just such a difficult thing, as you might imagine, to cover all the languages, and of course those that are hearing impaired. Number 37, Peter, I'm currently seeking financial aid for college, and of course have relied heavily on loans, most of which are private bank loans. Is accumulating debt in general a stime in the movement and the movement's members? Staying off the grid is terribly hard when the last options are private bank loans. Basically, I'm a kid who needs money and has every intention of dedication to the Zeitgeist Movement. Well, I'm right there with you. It wasn't until last year I paid off my $80,000 student loan, and that was just a painful thing to have to go through year after year. I only went to school for 2 years, by the way, and dropped out because I realized what a financial atrocity it was. I'm not going to tell you what to do as far as financial aid for your college, but I just strongly recommend you assess the numbers, that the debt you're going to go into, and what you're going to get out of it, and what you hope to accomplish. That's really it. If you're going into a field that can't generate income that's going to enable you to get out of debt fairly quickly, then I certainly wouldn't recommend going into the type of absurd amounts of debt for it. I hate to be cynical of the educational system, but college is a business and nothing more. With the advent of the internet and the immense amount of information that you can get through libraries and through digital media, it's only having that piece of paper. There's so much information available to anybody that wants to learn just about anything, really. it's only the hands-on things that college comes into play, such as doctors that need access to equipment. They have to train on real equipment, therefore they have to have a resource to do so. You can't just do that at home. As opposed to, say, getting a law degree, which anybody that can read, again, I don't like law, but I'm just giving this as an example, anybody can read about this information and they can learn what they need to know through their own diligence. So, I understand your interest. You have to make your own decisions on that. I do, generally speaking, try to go into as little debt as possible. It's just the worst thing that you can do to yourself at this point. Debt is the ultimate prison cell. I find it funny as an aside, not funny, but if the United States government gave a shit about the U.S. economy, really, they wouldn't have bailed out any of the banks. They wouldn't have nationalized the auto industry or the financial industry or any of the attributes or the loan industry. They would have taken the public debt, well, private debt, I think is the technical term. They would have assessed the debt of all of the Americans, and they would have given them some form of debt relief coupon, say 50 to 60% of their entire debt. That's what they would have done if they cared. They don't, because the public is the last thing they care about. If they had done that, the public immediately would have had more money to spend. And that is really the issue. If the public doesn't have money to spend, which they still don't, no economy is going to flourish. It's so obvious and so transparent that it's just mind-blowing. It's just mind-blowing that things are just ass backwards. But again, it's by design. Number 38, as far as John Perkins and Ellen Brown, I was wondering how these two felt about the Zeitgeist Movement and whether they were active in supporting it. Both of them very much agree with many of the attributes there, but both of them also seem to have their own establishment to perpetuate. I think John Perkins is doing a fantastic job of spreading information. He has a new book coming out that's going to deal with his perception of solutions. And it's solutions within the establishment, which I think are great, and it's a part of the transition, and I think it's very positive. In my communications with John, I've yet to be able to pin him down to address the very specific instances of what we talk about. He's a very busy guy. He appreciated the film a lot, and he agreed with it, but as far as their activity, again, it's too radical for most people. As far as Ellen Brown, I think it might be similar. She writes wonderful articles on revising the financial system, which everyone should read. It's just they don't go far enough as far as I'm concerned, and that's basically it. I haven't pushed them to try and be representative of the movement, and honestly, I don't think they would full-on be representative of it, but I don't know that for sure. But we'll see what happens. I'm in subtle communication with both of them, and who knows? I think the new film will hopefully bring in some people that are still of a cynical mind when it comes to these points. They just don't have the full story. They just don't quite buy it, and they don't have enough information to buy it yet, so to speak. Number 39, I understand the concept of rebuilding new cities as being more efficient in the long run. But what will happen to the millions of current cities? I feel as though some cities possess certain aspects which people wouldn't want to leave, such as location, which is the case for the town I currently live in. My belief is that although many new cities will be built following designs similar to Jacques Fresco, we also need to be ready to rebuild many of the old cities, as some will undoubtedly be favorable to rebuild rather than abandon. Your thoughts? Well, first of all, the location is still there. It's not abandoned per se. Maybe in certain instances, I guess something like that might be relevant. But New York City, for example, a massive project would need to go from the tip of the island down to just utterly renovate everything, from the tunnels, from just literally from the rock up. And that's otherwise you're just going to be stuck with patchwork of this system, of this extremely outdated infrastructure, and old buildings. I mean, if you've ever been in New York, it's perpetually under construction, and the construction methods are ancient methods. They're not using new methods. The construction companies have to make money, so they use crappy materials, and they use the same weak concrete and all the general construction primitive construction methods that are currently used in patching things up. Location would be the same. There's no issue on that. As far as museums in general, as far as cities in general, there'd be museum cities that would be left, I think, for romantics. I think there's a place for that. That would be very unique. And then Other cities, the resources, of course, would be utilized. It's not that you just wipe things out. You would utilize whatever you can. And that goes for just about everything in society. You reuse everything. You have an entire system dedicated to doing so. So I hope I answered your question. Um, It'd be wonderful if you could just move everybody off the island of Manhattan and bulldoze the whole thing and get all the resources on it and then rebuild from scratch. But the reason you can't do that, the reason you can't do it in any way, excuse me, is because the financial system won't allow it. The financial system is a process, and it's just you can't have that type of larger order renovation. It's nearly impossible, and that's why it's so stifling and paralyzing. Number 40. Hello, Peter. I've noticed that people understand the problems in modern day society, but they don't see the solution. What I mean is, in order to believe that the Venus Project is not only talk, they need to actually see an example of what they could be fighting for. Otherwise, they will not want to take action. Therefore, don't you think the first step, when there are enough followers of the movement, should be creating a small Venus Project-based society? Well, Venus Project-based society, not society in that term, but a research center is what needs to be created, an example to show, to express the technical abilities, to show how people engage it, to relay the value systems. So a small Venus Project-based society is going to be poetic, but unless you have outrageous amounts of money, you're going to be faced with some serious barriers to create a commune type of environment. Not to mention that I see so many different problems that I'm not going to go into right now as far as making just an arbitrary city. The real issue is a representative city to show what is possible and to attract people to it, to make it also amusing and fun, to make people that like if the city was eventually done, then Zeitgeist Day or whatever it would ever be called would take place in this city, and we'd attempt to get as many people as possible in this research facility and give massive presentations and show demonstrations. You pull in all sorts of different scientists. Anyway, I must stop rambling on that. I've already addressed that many different times. Basically, we need to build a research facility. Number 42. As some of you may know, autism has been more common than ever, and I live with a sister who has it. Also, I used to have a disorder that was related to autism, but eventually overcame it. I don't know if you may have the information for this or not, but is there any sort of way on how exactly people with mental disabilities will be dealt with in the transition from the monetary system to the Venus Project? I don't think people have talked about this, and I most certainly think it should be discussed. I think the treatment would be improved. I think it's a tough question. Ultimately, since the financial system has dramatic limitations on the treatment of people, another example is old people, the people that are elderly. They're put in these homes. This isn't the humane way to go about any of this. Everyone should be, whether you have a learning disability or what have you, everyone should be in the same spectrum socially. We shouldn't be segregating society. Granted, people have different needs, but people will learn to respect each other for their differences in that regard. As far as the transition, I would have to say that it would be more humane treatment the farther we get into the Venus Project. You won't have these limited budgets for certain disabilities that go to certain schools. It wouldn't work like that. There would be equal time dedicated to such things. So I hope I answered your question. That's a very difficult one. All I can really say is that it would be much more positive when you don't have the financial limitations. There'd be so much more support. So, number 43, I'm running out of time. I have 5 minutes left. I wanted to know what are the possibilities for the current economy to get better or get out of the hole it is in right now. Is there a trick or plan that they have to do this? Something like the Amero? How would this affect overall? I would like to hear more about monetary economics and its failures nowadays. I think the transition now is to get all money onto plastic, get all money into digital form, and to try to remove transparency as much as possible. As most know, M3 is no longer around. And once a world system of monetary currency is put into place, which is in the cards, whether it's called the Amero or not doesn't matter. That would be the North American Union currency. All that stuff has been pushed to the side now, probably because of the upheaval of various people speaking out against it. the issue will be to negate transparency and to try and basically put everything under the carpet. When the government bails out these industries, there's a lot more going on under the surface than just these loans. The It's more of a scapegoat. It's more of just, again, sweeping it under the carpet. I really wish you could see the follow-up to a lot of these actions, because I think there's a lot of fraud inherent in all of it. The bailout of the banks specifically, I mean, it's really fiction. The money never existed. They just say, okay, have all this money, bail out, that's the end of it, and we're going to keep looking the other way, and that's basically what's happened. I think the system could recover from its current demise, and they could create a new value system based on heavy amounts of value and value and service orientations, like a cultural commercialization, where instead of people, technological automation will continue, technological unemployment will continue, but they'll reassess the not for labor, but value will be assessed to lifestyle and all sorts of cultural ramifications. They'll sell you lifestyle. And I think that's the gravitation that you're seeing right now. I think poverty will increase regardless. I think, in fact, I know it will, because of population growth and technological unemployment in and of themselves is going to increase poverty, because the only way that you can actually achieve higher output is to use technology at this stage, which means less people. That statistic was noted very thoroughly in the UK lecture. So as far as them bailing out the system, it's more of a psychological bailout. It only worked for the middle class and those that are willing to look the other way, look away from the ongoing wars, look away from the increasing poverty. No one has a relevance of this system in the sense of how it works, or what would qualify it as, quote, working. Some people say the system works now. Does it really? I wouldn't say it works at all. I'd say it's an absolute failure on almost every single level, because of the mass poverty, because of the mass environmental destruction, because of the outrageous atrocities of human behavior, because of the growing worldwide prison population. Something's definitely wrong, but they chalk that up to other things. So I don't know how to answer your question effectively, other than the fact that, yes, they do have tricks up their sleeve. It's going to be to covertly change the perception of the people into something different. And our goal is to change the perception of people into something different as well, but positive values and a positive usage and diligent, intelligent, rational, and logical usage of the resources of the planet, and as opposed to the preservation of scarcity and manipulation that the establishment is doing now to preserve its power structure. Number 44, about 1 minute left here. Do you think if we created a fully automated VP show house, it would help people visualize living in the Venus Project Society? Yes. I mean, in Zeitgeist Day 2010, I'm going to attempt to do something like that. That as not a show house per se. Well, I guess I could use that term if I understand you correctly. And we will have on display different information and models and things like that. I think that would be very powerful. The Research City, however, would be the larger show house or showcase, which would show things in actual operation on probably a miniature level. And I'm running out of time. I appreciate all of your questions. I'm sorry I didn't get through all of them, but I will be back soon, and I hope everyone's doing well with everything, and I hope I didn't ramble too much. And I will talk to you guys in about 2 weeks, and I'll keep you guys posted on the forum of any developments and such. Thank you.